Please welcome to the stage Museum Trustees and Gala Co-Chairs Meryl Snow Ziegler and Michelle Merman.
Thank you. Good evening and welcome. We are so pleased to see all of you here this evening. I am Meryl Snow Ziegler, co-chair of the board of the Tenement Museum and co-chair of tonight's gala, along with my co-chair here, Michelle Merman. I truly thank you for joining us in celebrating rebuilding our foundations. And here is co-chair Michelle to welcome you further.
Thank you. Thank you, Meryl. Good evening, everyone. It is our great pleasure to welcome you here tonight, our guests at City Winery, and the hundreds of households joining us virtually across the country. We are grateful to each of you for your outstanding generosity and the support that is helping us rebuild our foundations. We have a terrific program for you tonight, but first things first, there are many to thank. A most heartfelt thanks to our sponsors, our host committee, and our corporate sponsors, American Express, BCG, Con Edison, EY, Geller & Company, Greenberg, Traeger & Herbst, Handel Architects, and the Durst Organization. Your generosity and friendship are deeply valued. I also wish to recognize and thank Manhattan Borough President Mark Levine, Councilmember Christopher Marte, and the New York City Council, and the Department of Cultural Affairs for their tremendous support in helping us preserve our National Historic Landmark at 97 Orchard Street. In addition, this evening could not happen without the wonderful staff at our museum who have done an outstanding job. Finally, while we are here to celebrate, tonight is also the museum's biggest fundraiser of the year. So later this evening, we will be asking for your generous help to rebuild our foundation. Thank you in advance. Now, without further ado, our dynamic, creative, tireless, brilliant leader, President Annie Polland.
Those are a lot of adjectives to live up to. We did not put that in the remarks, but it's greatly appreciated, and it's wonderful. It's wonderful to be here tonight with you, here in City Winery's spacious and airy and decidedly untenement-like hall. We are also joined by our virtual community. Over 28 states, well, over several hundred households from 28 states and several countries. So one of the things that's so wonderful is that we're able to continue virtual, not because we have to, but because we want to. And because the virtual and our broader tenement community has become a vital thread in our museum. So we're all here tonight to celebrate our foundations and the rebuilding of our foundations. In one quite literal sense, we celebrate the amazing reconstruction project on our landmark building, 97 Orchard Street. We've already strengthened the foundations and every floor with steel. We didn't do it. Conrad Puck, I think, is here, and his team. And we thank Kalmar for all of that wonderful work. And what that work does, it prepares our building to welcome visitors for generations to come. On another level, on an educational level, and I would even argue spiritual level. We are rebuilding our tours and expanding our stories, and that is also part of rebuilding our foundations. Why do we do this work? Why are we here? As you walked in, whether you entered the YouTube room or virtual room, or whether you entered this room here at City Winery, you might have noticed a beautiful image of 97 Orchard with the windows. And as you looked at the windows, you could see the families who lived at 97 Orchard and 103 Orchard, and you might have also spotted some of the families of our honorees, of our trustees, and of our staff. And we did that not because it was cute, although it was pretty cute. Seeing a 7-year-old Gary Handel in a window with his parents was really exciting, as well as the beautiful grandchildren that are part of our tenement families. But we did it to remind ourselves of what brought us to the Tenement Museum in the first place. So many of us come to the Tenement Museum because of a relationship we had with a grandparent or some relative. And these, when you're 4 years old, you don't know the word genealogy, but you know the word grandparent. And when you're 4 years old, you might not know the term history, but you know the term stories. And I think it's those stories that we hear when we're young from our relatives, from our grandparents, and sometimes it's the stories that we don't hear, right? That also sparks our curiosity and sparks our imagination. And that's what brings us to a place like the Tenement Museum. And then what the Tenement Museum does is it takes your grandparents and your ancestors out of their picture frames, because most of the time they were not posing for a photo. And at the Tenement Museum, we show them carrying buckets of water up flights of stairs. We show them reading a Yiddish newspaper or an Italian newspaper or a Chinese newspaper. We see them listening to Italian opera. We start to imagine them in the world that they were in. And what we also do is we bring all of these strands, all of these stories together. What we try to do is derive meaning and find meaning from the very messy stories our ancestors have left us. So I just want to share a few stories from grandparents. Cheryl Call, I hope she's out there in our live stream. Cheryl Call lives in Sitka, Alaska. And she became connected to the Tenement Museum during the pandemic when she tuned into our virtual programs. She came to every single program, and she wrote beautiful, lovely thank you notes after each one. And when we did our first virtual gala about 2 years ago, she sent a story of her own grandmother. Her grandmother, Josephine Jane Graves Mossop, left Jamaica in 1918 on a steamship to New York, where she met her husband, she married, and she started to raise children. She also sold liquor from a bathtub. I connected to this story, I don't drink. No, wait. I connected to the story because my own great-grandmother sold bathtub gin. She came also on a steamboat, but from the Ukraine. And as a divorced mother of 7, the bottle business helped her get by. This is a theme we explore every day at the Tenement Museum. How do mothers, especially mothers with young children, how can they bring in income? What were the choices they had? And typically in school, when we think about the Prohibition, or when Prohibition is taught, it's taught through the 18th Amendment, and if you're lucky, maybe a little window onto organized crime. But telling the story through Josephine and Esther Malka Singer gives us a new perspective. We're going to hear tonight from Anita Jacobson, one of the founders of the Tenement Museum. And she tells a story of her grandparents and her parents' flight from Europe in 1939. And as she reflects on that story, she talks about how it made her think about how every newcomer, all newcomers, have to think through starting a new life, and how the importance of finding connection to each other through that process. And that is baked into the very foundations of our Tenement Museum. Tonight, the historian Leslie Harris, who is here with us, is going to read a letter that Gina Manuel wrote to the Tenement Museum. Who is Gina Manuel? She was just an everyday New Yorker, a Black New Yorker, and she heard Ruth Abram on WNYC talking about the Tenement Museum. And hearing that word tenement sparked memories in her of her own grandmother's stories, of their ancestors living in tenements. And she interpreted her own family story, passed down through her grandmother, as a charge to keep broadening what history is and to make New York remember her family and those ancestors. Lonnie Bunch, Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, who we are honoring tonight, roots his beginnings as a historian to his childhood when his grandfather, a dentist, shared a book with him. In the book, they looked together at a photograph of students in a classroom, and the caption underneath it said, "Unidentified children." And that made him want to spend his life putting names and stories to those who would otherwise be unidentified and forgotten. In so doing, he builds the foundation of our study of history, and he nourishes our humanity. As you can see, these stories, just like the stories we tell at the museum, are memories that don't just sentimentalize. Rather, they are shared to envision multiple perspectives, to expand our understanding of history, and to propel us forward. We take these stories and many more, and they become the ingredients for tours that share our nation's ruptures and its progress. And now, as we research the story of Joseph and Rachel Moore, a Black family who lived in the tenements in the 1860s and the 1870s, we go back to our very building's foundations. Our building was built in 1863, in the middle of the Civil War. So now we grapple with the Civil War and what the historian Eric Foner refers to as the second founding of our country. And we look at this not from the perspective of a battlefield, nor from the perspective of the White House, but we look at it from the perspective of a rear tenement building. What did Joseph and Rachel Moore, with a portrait of Abraham Lincoln on their wall, think when they learned Joseph might finally vote, just like his Irish neighbors? How did they maintain hope in the face of continued economic and political discrimination, despite the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments? We can't wait to welcome you to their recreated home to explore these questions. When we do our work at the tenement, we often look for the descendants of the stories that we're telling of the families, and which is exciting, and we found some wonderful, exciting descendants for Joseph Moore. But in some ways, what was more exciting was finding a newspaper story about Joseph Moore's grandmother, Isabella Moore, who was born in 1770 in New Jersey. She was born free, but then spent the years from 8 to 18 in servitude. And she married a man, Abraham Moore, who was born enslaved, but then became free. She lived to be 107 years old. What stories did Isabella tell Joseph? We know that Joseph was connected to her. At least we know he named his daughter, his first daughter, after her. The Tenement Museum itself is a family. We are the descendants of Harris and Jenny Levine. We are the descendants of Adolfo and Rosaria Baldizzi, of Joseph and Bridget Moore, and we are also the descendants, all of us, of Joseph and Rachel Moore. And as we form this tenement community, we form a nation of grandchildren, eager to learn more in order to expand our understanding of our nation's history and also to form a stronger, more resilient foundation for our future. Our mission is to build a more expansive, inclusive, and pluralistic country. I am very humbled to be part of a wonderful line of Tenement Museum presidents. Morris Vogel is in the room today. He was president of the museum from 2008 until 2017, and then came back at the greatest need, the moment of need for the museum, and helped save it from the pandemic. And of course, we are all humbled by the vision and creativity of Ruth Abram, who, with Anita Jacobson, created the Tenement Museum. She couldn't be here tonight, but she has graciously sent us a message.
It is such a thrill for me that my hero, Lonnie Bunch, and my forever friend, Anita Jacobson, are honored this evening. Lonnie, you managed to wrest our history from the grip of the narrow vision which hampered our seeing America clearly. Now at the helm of the Smithsonian, I am certain you will make the changes needed to convey our national story so that all of us will be able to take our rightful place in it. Congratulations, Lonnie. When I think of you, Anita Jacobson, I think of moving furniture. When we moved into the basement of 97 Orchard Street, you took one end of a donated bench and I the other, and we walked it down Orchard Street to furnish the museum's first office. While we understood 19th century tenements were cold water flats, we had not understood that our rent did not include heat. Undeterred, you worked wearing gloves. When I think of you, Anita, I think of determination. You did not give up when a leader in historic preservation rejected our request for help, writing, "A tenement has no redeeming architectural value. No one of importance ever lived there, and anyway, there are thousands of them." You didn't flinch when Irving Howe, the great chronicler of the history of the Lower East Side, refused to serve as an advisor, convinced as he was that we would glorify poverty. Through the formative years we worked together, in the face of what many believed were insurmountable odds, you were stalwart in your belief that there would one day be a tenement museum. Since it opened, you and your husband, Bob, have remained dependable and enthusiastic supporters. All of us, and mostly I, Anita, owe you a great deal of thanks. Thank you.
Tell me about what's going on here.
Well, we're about a month into the renovation project. We have a doll's head here that was found in the floorboards. We will do some research on this particular artifact. It's very difficult to document this material because a lot of it has never been documented before. So we have a real task ahead of us, which will take us years. So, but we're excited about it.
Oh my heavens. Look at this.
Look at that
See?
bathroom, my
Wow.
God. Nothing has changed.
Right. Wonderful though. I bet her eyes opened and closed. Well, I think because there's cotton in there. Probably can't do it anymore. But it's a beautiful, really beautiful
It looks
piece.
like it, yeah, it looks like it was, there was hair here definitely. Did you find
Ruth Abram, whose idea all of this was, is always thinking of moving us into a tenement because she wanted to tell the stories of immigrants who came to the Lower East Side and lived here. And so we were trying to find an authentic tenement to tell those stories. So I was walking on Orchard Street. We were actively looking. I saw a for rent sign in one of the windows in this building. And we walked up the stairs and into the hallway, and I immediately knew that we had found the building we were looking for. It was as though the building had found us.
I remember you were like, well, you know, we found a building, we don't have any heat, the toilet kind of works, and also don't touch the walls. And the light was like dangling, barely dangling, and I was like looking at it going,
Yeah.
yeah.
We had very, very little money, but we managed to raise the money and we bought the building.
And you said we didn't have it.
Yeah.
I said, find it because, well, the rest is history.
You know, we're always looking towards the next day, the next week, the next year. And then to stop and pause and think about your past and think about what you did. I never do that. And to sit here with my children and grandchildren, doing that for me was a very emotional experience. I was also impressed that they, I think, were not terribly bored.
In second grade, we were focusing on immigration. The Tenement Museum was one of the field trips we took, and I was able to tell people, like, oh, my grandmother started this museum. And I felt so special, like a celebrity, because people treated me like one too. And I just remember like coming in and I would like keep saying like, oh my God, my grandma founded this. I felt like super excited being in the tenement itself, like here, because I could see everything, what it was like back then. And I just enjoyed that.
This is my grandmother's identity card. She was living in Antwerp, Belgium, and she had to escape. My family escaped and ended up going through Biarritz and coming to this country. I don't know how they all did that. I'm just overwhelmed thinking about it, you know, having to pick up from your home and just leaving. It's all about people having to leave their homes and having to make new homes elsewhere and having to learn new ways, having to learn new languages, trying to make the best of it. And I think that's always the story. Learning that everybody's in the same boat, basically, that we all went through a process of adjustment and we're all kind of in it together and we have to really appreciate each other and understand each other more. And I think that's what the museum accomplishes. I'm hopeful that the rebuilding of the foundation of the museum will enable it to be here for another 100 years and to continue to expand the programming and do the wonderful job that they've been doing in the past. Wow, that was really amazing. Thank you, everybody who did that. Thank you, Annie, trustees, the dedicated staff, and to all who helped create this museum. I am honored and humbled to be chosen to receive the Founders Award. In 1938, FDR addressed the daughters of the American Revolution, saying, remember always that all of us, and you and I especially, are descended from immigrants and revolutionists. I am the child of immigrants. In 1939, my parents arrived in the United States on one of the last passenger ships to leave the port of Antwerp, Belgium. Had they stayed just a few weeks longer, I wouldn't be standing here. I felt torn between two cultures. As I saw it, I was neither American nor European. Growing up, I was uncomfortable with my parents' broken English and frustrated by their inability to help with my schoolwork. What ultimately drew me to the concept of the Tenement Museum was its mission to promote tolerance and understanding of our differences as humans. I would like to tell you a few short stories about how the museum was born. It was the brainchild of the remarkable Ruth Abram. A mutual friend knew that we shared some common interests and arranged for us to meet in a dingy kosher restaurant on Delancey Street. Ruth's vision and magnetic personality captivated me, and I volunteered to work with her to help realize her long-cherished idea for a tenement museum on the Lower East Side. We began by renting space in the cold, musty basement of the old Eldridge Street Synagogue, out of which we conducted tours of the neighborhood. Our friendship grew along with Ruth's dream. We hired a receptionist/secretary who managed to combine his secretarial duties with the need to stay warm by cutting the fingertips off of his gloves in order to type. What little money we had, we banked in a small white envelope. Eventually, we had to move out of the synagogue, which was going to undergo restoration. Looking for office space, walking down Orchard, I discovered the old tenement building at number 97. It was as though the building was beckoning us and had been patiently waiting to tell its stories to the millions of visitors who would one day come to call. The darkness of the tenement at 97 Orchard Street had given way to shed light on the story of a long neglected urban immigrant history. For our opening celebration, we hired costumed actors to portray immigrants from various countries and placed them inside a few of the apartments. Hiring actors was expensive, so to save money, we posted an authentic quarantine sign that warned of smallpox on one of the apartment doors. The then Mayor Ed Koch, who came to our opening, saw the sign and standing in the hallway shouted, "Don't worry, they'll soon find a cure." So, another incident in particular sticks in my memory. It gave me a unique, visceral appreciation of life on the Lower East Side at the turn of the century. At the time, a common sight on the streets was the push carts full of shellfish. As part of the Descendants of Former Residents celebration, we decided to create an authentic street fair that included an actual period pushcart. I went to a seafood restaurant, collected hundreds of empty oyster shells, and filled the pushcart with them. So far, so good. As it sat in the hot sun, a few flies arrived. Within a short time, word went out, and every fly from New Jersey, Long Island, and the 5 boroughs came to dinner. Between the constant buzzing and the overpowering bouquet of the shells, staff and visitors alike got a true sense of life on Orchard Street in the hot summer circa 1900. Living cheek to jowl with your neighbors, with more than 100 people in a single building and up to a dozen in one apartment, it was sometimes a recipe for friction and hostility. And yet, inside the tenement buildings of the Lower East Side, there was also a strong sense of community. As opposed to our lives of isolation today, these people were connected not by choice, but by necessity. As the museum rebuilds its foundations, it also looks forward to welcoming its newest tenants, Rachel and Joseph Moore, representing the story of the African American experience. I have been privileged to play a role in restoring dignity and a place in history to the millions who pass through the Lower East Side and beyond to call this country home. Visitors to the Tenement Museum continue to come away with a greater understanding of the contribution immigrants have made to America and the struggles they endure to both survive and thrive in the new world. Thank you. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. It's been a pleasure and an honor to work with the Tenement Museum for nearly a decade. My own research on New York City demonstrated that African Americans were part of the city from before its founding as New Amsterdam in 1626 through the Civil War. I argued that the experiences of and discussions and debates about slavery and freedom were a deep part of this city's history. Still, I was a little surprised when the Tenement Museum contacted me in 2017 to speak with museum educators here. My first book ended in 1863, the year that the tenement buildings were built. But this group of diverse people had a central question for me. How do we, as educators and as a museum, make vital connections for visitors about the histories of all the different groups of New Yorkers who have and still do live here? We discussed, and we continue to discuss, how experience of migration, both voluntary and coerced, labor, tenement life, and much more, were shared by New Yorkers across race and class. The Tenement Museum has worked hard to put the stories of all New Yorkers in conversation with each other. Although the histories of the museum's buildings have been rooted in the iconic European immigration of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the museum has expanded its timeline backward and forward to understand the world into which these immigrants landed. Central to that world were enslaved African Americans who had worked the land and built the original infrastructure of what became Manhattan, and free African Americans who worked the same jobs, walked the same streets, and shared the same hopes and dreams for themselves, their families, and their communities. The Tenement Museum has eagerly sought opportunities to demonstrate that the history of European immigrants is not the only exemplary story of New York City, but is one among the multiple amazing histories contained in this extraordinary city and in this nation. The current public turmoil in our country about African American history is rooted in the idea that we can't be as capacious, complex, and even compassionate enough to embrace all parts of who we have been and who we are in this nation. But the truth is that many, if not most of us, are ready and willing to embrace our complex history with honesty. In doing so, the Tenement Museum is working towards a vision outlined by Gina Manuel at the time of the Tenement Museum's development in the late 1980s. Ms. Manuel heard Ruth Abrams on WNYC and wrote her a letter stating that she was thrilled that Abrams was working on saving the history of her own family and Old New York. A full copy of Manuel's letter is in your gala journal. Gina Manuel wrote that she had ancestors in this city back to the 1700s. They were African Americans, and their names were Lawrence, Nolan, and Downing. Her grandmother, great-grandmother, and father were dwellers in the tenements of Old New York City and lived in Minetta Lane and Prince Street. The men worked in the Old South Street Seaport, and they attended Old St. Patrick's Church. They were pushed out by the new immigrants in the beginning of the century and moved from the Lower East Side to Hell's Kitchen and Chelsea, the Tenderloin in the West 40s, and finally to the West 50s, which was called Old San Juan Hill. Gina Manuel wanted to be sure that Ruth Abrams would include African Americans, her ancestors. She wrote, "So when you are planning the museum, I beg you, please, please don't forget them. Their spirits walk those halls and their bones lay in the earth there, and we remember them. Most of society seems to write us off when they look at the history of New York City and America, but my people were part of New York City long before it was a city as such. Some of them, like my great-grandmother, told us about the Civil War riots in 1863, when they burned down the old colored orphanage, when Lincoln Hospital, the old building, was for sick and poor slaves. They did laundry, swept chimneys, laid bricks, tarred roofs, and did serve in the army in all the wars and deserved to be remembered." I'm proud to be a part of the Tenement Museum's effort to heed Gina Manuel's call for a fuller history. As an historian, I can say that we are in a moment when the call for an inclusive and more true history is echoing across this nation. Our ancestors and our own children are demanding it of us, and we can make this happen. Now, when the Tenement Museum began the latest iteration of this expansive work, the Joseph and Rachel Moore exhibit that's currently in progress, staff members had the opportunity to travel to the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. to seek inspiration from the incomparable Secretary of the Smithsonian, Lonnie Bunch. As most of you know, Lonnie Bunch and his colleagues at the Smithsonian stayed the course for decades to make the dream of the National Museum a reality. The museum and its staff are both an example of what can be done and active mentors for museums across the nation. We now have a short film about that visit.
Over the next 6 months, the Tenement Museum is working towards opening our next permanent exhibit. This exhibit will be up on the 5th floor of our historic tenement at 97 Orchard Street. And in this 5th floor apartment, we will recreate the tenement home of Joseph and Rachel Moore. They were Black New Yorkers who lived in a tenement just a little less than a mile west of 97 Orchard Street in the 1860s and 70s. The Tenement Museum Education Department decided to bring a group of our educators down to the National Museum for African American History and Culture, of course, because we love a field trip, but also the way that the National Museum has been able to tell a bigger story through personal stories is exactly what we're hoping to do with our new Joseph and Rachel Moore exhibit, and is, of course, so connected to the way that we think about all of our stories at the museum.
The theme of the museum is make a way out of no way. What are the things you put together to survive, to thrive? And it's less about, while they're there, Frederick Douglass or King or even Harriet Tubman, and it's more about the totality of people who were famous only to themselves.
I think drawing that connection between what I experienced and what I was exposed to at the Museum of African American History and Culture with how we want to talk about and interpret Joseph and Rachel Moore's story here at the Tenement Museum. I think there were so many examples of the making of a home.
There was a cabin, and this was a space that was formerly a home for folks who were enslaved, and it was a home until the 1980s. It had been donated to the museum, and there were pieces of wallpaper. And I thought about all the wallpaper that we have at the Tenement Museum and how wallpaper is this small thing that you can do to create a space in a home, and it's a way of self-expression and adornment, and it's also this resistance. I am forced to be here, but a space can still be a refuge for me, and I thought of all of the ways that people can take a home and make it a safe space when maybe the outside world isn't always safe.
Beyond getting to see the exhibits and the stories at the museum, the opportunity to meet with Secretary Bunch was really once in a lifetime.
The key for any good educator is a nimbleness, right? An ability to sort of pivot to make sure the greatest educational platform is there. And I think that in some ways, the key here is learning and opportunity, right? So that means that what you want to do is lay the foundation so they go home and go, geez, I just have to think about something in a very different way. And I think that's the power of good educators.
Hearing Secretary Bunch describe what he wanted out of a visitor's experience at the African American History and Culture Museum was really important to me. To hear him talk about the balance between resilience and struggle, to hear him bring in pieces of human experiences in Black American history, then even to hear him talk about what it means to be an educator. It really made me think about things in a new way.
Being able to talk with Secretary Bunch and being able to hear about his own experiences was really insightful for me personally. Today, all around the country, you have attacks on that ability to teach that type of history. You see a lot of that history being censored, being written off, being whitewashed out of the textbooks quite literally. And being able to have the courage and the bravery to, understand the hard truths of this country and about its history, and particularly how Black people have been involved in that history from day one. I don't think there's anything more important than that.
I wanted people to go through a museum and say, look at how people have helped America live up to its ideals. It's now my turn. So I think that's what good cultural institutions can do. They can be the glue that holds nations together. They can be the light that really illuminates all the dark corners. And most importantly, they can be the places where you can find hope.
I'm most excited for more people to see themselves reflected in our stories. It's something that I think has been a long time coming, and we've had visitors ask, what about Black New Yorkers? We've had students ask that question, and we'll finally be able to give a full, direct response to that question. I know when my parents came to visit the museum probably 12 years ago when I first started working here, even though they were on a tour about a German Jewish and Italian Catholic family, they still saw connections to their own family migration stories, but I think this will resonate even more.
When I think about my experiences as, just growing up and going to school and the times in which we would talk and learn about Black history, it's usually, the very big picture stuff. We're talking about slavery, we're talking about the Civil War, and usually, it will end at the Civil Rights Movement, and that's pretty much the end of it. But for us to be able to point out a particular family that lived here in New York City, and even as you have the end of the Civil War, even as you have Reconstruction, these things that might seem very far away, very abstract for these students, we can make it very real for them.
I'm a big fan of the Tenement Museum because in some ways what the Tenement Museum reminds us is the power of place. The Tenement Museum puts you in the midst of something that you can understand. That you can understand that it's a story reduced to human scale. You can understand that when you're looking out and imagining, you could try to understand what it is that people who lived here were grappling with. How did they find happiness? How did they find hope? How did they find work? All the things that everybody who comes through really is on their mind. This is really an opportunity to give the public a reservoir of possibility, a reservoir of understanding, a reservoir that can be transformative. So for me, public history is about making those little plans. It's about how do you use the work you do to transform not just a family, but a nation.
Good evening. I'm from the Baptist Church. Good evening. Thank you. I hope you all enjoyed that film. I want to thank Annie and her staff for putting together such a beautiful evening. I'm Dr. Christina Greer. I'm a proud trustee of the Tenement Museum. I have no idea what I did to sort of get linked up with Annie Pollan and this beautiful museum and all the great stories that we continue to tell. And the highlight of my professional career is interviewing Lonnie Bunch.
All I want to do is hang out with the cool kids. That's it.
I'm trying not to fangirl. Usually I'm pretty unflappable, but this is, it's kind of a big deal, as Joe Biden would say. So tonight's honoree, Lonnie Bunch III, the 14th Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, and the first historian to serve in that position. So shout out to Leslie Harris and the historians in the room. And Secretary Bunch's accomplishments are way too numerous to list, but I'm going to include a few. As secretary, he oversees 21 museums, 21 libraries, a national zoo, numerous research centers, and several educational units and centers as well. 2 new museums, the National Museum of the American Latino and the Smithsonian American Women's History Museum, are both in development. I've been hearing great things about both of those. You were the founding director of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. I was just there on Saturday for the Griot Gala. It was gorgeous. And you chronicled your journey in your book, A Fool's Errand, Building the National Museum of African American History and Culture in the Age of Bush, Obama, and Trump. And in 2021, it's a pretty big deal. And in 2021, you received France's highest award, the Legion of Honor. Do I curtsy? What do we do? Do we have to call you something, monsieur?
That's right.
Okay.
I get through security quickly in Airfront Pass.
That's fantastic.
You know?
So I'm beyond humbled and excited to have just a brief conversation with you this evening about your career, about your accomplishments, in so many ways that the work that you've done and the foundations you've laid sort of parallel the work that we're doing here at the Tenement Museum and the work that we're going to continue to do with the Joseph and Rachel Moore exhibit. So the first question I have is, in your book called The Lost Dream Back, you write about a book you found in your grandfather's basement that was alluded to. Tell us a little bit more about this book.
Well, I was lucky because I had a grandfather who really believed in education. And I used to sneak down in the basement of my house in Belleville, New Jersey, and that one day he would read to me. And he found this book and it had pictures of school children. And he said that this picture was probably 80, 90 years ago. And then he said, these kids are probably no longer alive. And when you're 5 years old, somebody that looks like you is no longer alive. It was really telling. And then he said those words I've never forgotten. He said, isn't it a shame people could live their lives and it just says unidentified and anonymous? And for me, that's been my whole life, is to sort of make visible those left out of history, give voice to those that are anonymous, to make sure we as Americans understand that while it's crucially important to study the names we think we know, it's even more important to study the names of people who are only famous for their families. And that this has really been what has shaped my entire career. And I would argue the other part of it comes from growing up in this town where we were the only black family, and there were people that treated me horribly and people that treated me wonderfully. And I wanted to understand. And I thought if I understood the history first of this town and then later of the country, I could understand more, not just about me, but really find a way to help America be a better place.
I mean, I'm thinking about the video when Ruth says, you know, these people who live here, they're of no consequence. But if we think about, you know, Black history as American history, every single person has a story to tell, which is why, for those of you who are at home and for those of you who are in the audience, if you haven't checked out Your Story, Our Story at the Tenement Museum, where we connect these stories and artifacts of our histories to show that these narratives are all connected in sort of this country in a very complex and troubling narrative that we have. So in a recent interview you did with Elizabeth Alexander, you explained that the Tenement Museum resonates with people because we invite people into recreated homes and everyone can relate to the concept of home. You also spoke about how history's very complexities are helpful in today's culture, as our study of complex past helps us better grasp nuances and debates in the present. What's your best advice in regard to making people feel comfortable learning and discussing topics that cause discomfort? I'm comfortable talking about race, but I realize not everybody is.
Well, you know, when I'm cynical, I'm saying just do it. Have the courage, because it strikes me that we are comfortable saying now that our grandparents' and great-grandparents' DNA shapes who we are, but we're not comfortable saying the history that shaped them also shapes us. And so for me, it's crucially important because, in essence, without understanding that history, you're sort of swimming in the dark. And that ultimately, what I believe very strongly is that part of what history does and part of what you do at the Tenement Museum is, on the one hand, you tell stories, but you also tell complexity. And that I would argue the greatest contribution historians, whether cultural institutions, can make is to help the public embrace ambiguity. Far too often, the public looks for simple answers to complex questions. And yet history allows you to understand complexity, nuance, subtlety. Imagine a nation that was more comfortable with debate and nuance than looking for simple answers. It really is a way to contribute mightily to helping to change a nation. And for me, the Tenement Museum does many things well, but the two that stay with me is, first of all, they humanize history. In order to help people understand complexity or grapple with questions they don't want to grapple with, if you can reduce it to human scale, if you go through the National Museum of African American History and Culture, every story is reduced to human scale. You see the sweep of slavery, but you see it through the lens of that slave cabin. And that in essence, by reducing it to human scale, you're also able to have people relate and engage and not let the great sweep of history wash over them, but rather to dig deeply into that story. And then the other thing that really strikes me about the Tenement Museum is we talk a lot in America about place, about home, and yet we really use it as a backdrop. The Tenement Museum says home is central to who you are, and that by understanding what went on in that home, you understand not just that family, but you understand immigration, you understand urbanization. So for me, it's this opportunity to say, how do we take something we all know, we all in search of home, but how do you use that then as the point of departure to tell a more complex, a more meaningful story?
Absolutely. So, as was spoken about this evening, we know that the Tenement Museum is adding the Joseph and Rachel Moore exhibit about a black family in the nearby tenement in the 1860s. I know you're a Jersey guy. That's the one ding on Lonnie Bunch.
That's right. Do not poke me in the eye, because I'll get you.
That's right.
It may take me a couple years, but I'm going to get you.
I always tell my students, I tease the Jersey students, but I'm like, you guys are tough, you can take it. So even though Lonnie Bunch is a Jersey guy at heart, what about New York City in the 1860s is most important to convey?
Well, in some ways, Leslie's work has been so important because what we tend to forget is that slavery and freedom shapes the entire country, shapes the Northern experience. And to be able to sort of tell that story through the lens of this family and what they did and how they sort of grappled with the sort of fragility of freedom, and that they're grappling with it also allows us to understand how central freedom was to not just their family, but to many families in New York. And so I think that it also allows us to really look at the interaction between race and immigrants. I grew up in an Italian town, so I grew up speaking Sicilian. And yeah, don't make me curse you out. But what I realized is by looking at the immigrants that I grew up with, it helped me understand where our commonalities were, it helped me understand where our differences, and it helped me understand that what we were all trying to do is figure out how to be part of this great nation and how to sort of live and love who we are, but to find ways to coexist with others that seem very different. And so in a way, I think that the challenge is really saying this is an opportunity to both tell a story of a family, but to tell a story of this complicated relationship between immigrants and race. Sometimes it's a story that's unbelievably positive, other times a story of negative and pain. And so I think that's really part of the opportunity that comes out of this, and it really comes out of great work like Leslie's work.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Leslie.
Thank you. And how I got looped into the Tenement Museum is because I met Annie so I could talk about my book, Black Ethnics, where I talk about Black Americans and Afro-Caribbean and African immigrants and the story of Black identity that's a lot more complex and nuanced in not just New York City, but obviously across the country, and thinking about immigration. And so moving to the present moment, in this hyper-partisan moment, for those of you who have not been to the African American History Museum, Smithsonian, Washington, D.C., which is the crown jewel in Lonnie's work, I implore you to go because Black history is American history, and what you've done is going to literally live in the history books forever, and I can't thank you enough for highlighting so much of our history. But we're in a moment where I tell my students, a lot of people thought democracy was something we could just put in a frame and hang on the wall and congratulate ourselves. And it's like, oh, we had a complex history and, chattel slavery and genocide and moving on. And now we're better, and we're clearly not. And so what are some of the roles or opportunities that history museums like the Tenement Museum, museums like the ones you oversee, what's their role, opportunity, or obligation in this conversation? And where do you see educators also in this role?
I think it's important to say we're not the Jeffersons moving on up, right? That in essence, that what you really have is an ongoing, permanent struggle to help a country live up to its stated ideals. And history museums have a major role to play in that. First of all, good history museums do something crucially important. They define reality and still give hope. That is an amazing gift. But I also think what history museums do is in this time, they've got to be the place that the public trusts. And they've got to have the courage to use that trust to make sure they counter the arguments that, oh, it's too difficult to talk about issues of race. Oh, people aren't strong enough to handle that. Hell, my father fought in World War II. They're strong enough to handle this kind of stuff. And so I think that for me, it is really an opportunity to say, we have to be places that give people that understanding of who we once were and help them understand how central that is to who we are today. That this is not about nostalgia. And this is really about, sort of as James Baldwin said, helping people understand that the past is what makes the present coherent. And that's really, to me, the great strength of history museums.
See, this is the difference between a historian and a political scientist, because I'm like, well, if I can live it, you can read about it. But I really appreciate you demystifying some of the complexities, because I think that so much of American history is a narrative that is whitewashed, either false, or skips over some really trying times, but also the community building that we've had, that the Tenement Museum, the Lower East Side, really exhibits about all the different families. How many people here have been to the Tenement Museum? Just making sure we have a show of hands. Okay. So how many people here have been to all of the exhibits at the Tenement Museum? So we'll get to the fundraising piece in a second, so we can go back. But I want to thank you for the work that you've done, the work that you continue to do, and for your support of the Tenement Museum. I'm so proud to be a trustee, but having you now in our Tenement Museum family is just a great honor for all of us. So thank you so much for joining us here tonight. Congratulations. Thank you, Secretary Bunch. Okay. Now. So this has been an amazing evening. We've heard from Anita and the discovery of 97 Orchard Street and the incredible work of Secretary Bunch, who's using history to build and strengthen our democracy. We've discussed cultural organizations like the Tenement Museum and how they play a unique and powerful role. And as I'm a proud trustee of this amazing institution, and in my role as a professor, I use stories of diverse families to build and learn different perspectives of the world today. And later this year, we will reopen 97 Orchard Street. I hope all of you will come and join us, and we'll welcome the Joseph and Rachel Moore exhibit, a Black family living in the tenements in 1860s, and we'll provide critical and unprecedented opportunities to illuminate the complex relationships between Blacks and immigrant history at the heart of our nation, and especially in our city. Obviously, now that we're still having conversations about immigration and integration, now the Tenement Museum is needed more than ever. But we also need your help to do this. So I would like for you all to join me in this support, to support this vital institution to help strengthen our storytelling on Orchard Street and beyond. For those of you who are out home, I don't know where my video is, so for those of you who are listening at home, you can do this too. So tonight we're setting a goal to raise $97,000. You get it? 97 Orchard Street, $97,000. In honor of our beloved Tenement Museum on 97 Orchard Street. And I'd like for you all to be generous and help us rebuild our foundations to ensure future generations can come visit and learn from the Tenement Museum. And I know we can do that. So we're gonna get started. Where are Gala co-chairs, Meryl Zagar and Michelle Merriman? Where are you? There's Meryl. Where's Michelle? We need more hands. Hi, Michelle. So they have both made a generous pledge of $9,700 each in honor of 97 Orchard Street. So please join me in thanking Meryl and Michelle for their support. And for those of us here at City Winery, there are pledge cards. Lift up your pledge cards. Okay. I can see more hands. We can lift up pledge cards. There we go. Pass them around, right? And there are pens at each table, and our staff is going to collect completed pledge cards. And where are our staff members with their hard hats? Get it? The hard hats, right? And so you can make a gift directly by scanning the QR code on the pledge cards. Or if you want to be a little more old school, you can fill out the pledge card with a pen. And for those of you at home, wherever you may be, we need your support as well. And you can make a gift by following the link in the chat. So there should be a chat right now. Alrighty. So here we go. Just so to give you a rough idea of what your donations can support. $10,000 will help create new tours and programs that enable thousands of school children to explore our new Joseph and Rachel Moore exhibit. That's what it will do. $5,000 will help preserve 97 Orchard Street to welcome generations to come. $2,500 will help thousands of New York City public school children experience 97 Orchard Street in person. And I don't know if you've ever taken a tour where a school group is there. They're absolutely amazed at what they see. $1,000 will help school children from classrooms across the country visit 97 Orchard Street through virtual field trips. $500 will help welcome leading scholars and experts to share new insights and knowledge with our educators. And $250 will help thousands from across the country explore tenement history through our virtual tenement talks and online exhibits. Okay, clearly the table in the back is having a blast, so I'm assuming that you all are talking about how much money you're giving. Let's hope. So, you can also join Meryl and Michelle and make a gift of $9,700, and I urge you to be generous, and your gift or pledge will provide crucial support and critical support for the museum and our work that uses the stories of ordinary families to help students explore the nation and our nation's complex history and build a more just and democratic future. Okay, I'm really curious, what's going on at that table in the back? Are they gonna be, maybe we should have like a table competition. Mike, what's the table next to you? What's their number? That's the chatty table. What is it? Table 28. We're doing it? You guys wanna be like the largest table with the best donations? I hope so. Do we see lots of pledge cards from table 28 since they're the chatty ones? That gives you a little window into my educational experience. So I want to thank all of you for your generosity preemptively. And with your help, I know we can reach our goal to raise $97,000 this evening in honor of 97 Orchard Street. And now it's my pleasure to introduce my fellow trustees and tonight's honorees, Gary Hendel, Scott Metzner, and Evan Wagowski. Come, gentlemen.
Hello, everyone. I'm Gary Hendel. 97, that's my crew. 97 Orchard is the beating heart of the Tenement Museum. It's as New York as a bagel, a slice, or a street dog with mustard and sauerkraut. It tells the stories of ordinary people, people like my grandparents, who arrived on the Lower East Side more than 125 years ago to make a better life for themselves and their families. Despite living in the most constrictive of spaces and facing unimaginable challenges, their striving showed a sense of possibility and openness to the world that we continue to benefit from. I'm proud that during my time at the museum, we've continued to expand the incredible diversity of stories that we tell, helping all of us understand how we fit into the American tapestry. Since the building was built in 1863, more than 7,000 people have called it home. And since the Tenement Museum opened, more than 3 million people have climbed its stairs, opened its doors, and taken tours. The passage of time and the intensity of use have taken its toll. Our responsibility with the renewal of 97 Orchard is to put it back in service for the next 150 years. Ensuring that the museum remains strong enough to welcome visitors and to make room for new exhibits so that we can continue to tell those stories requires construction, engineering, and planning, not to mention hundreds of emails, Zoom calls, and site visits. In my 18 years on the board of the Tenement Museum, I've undertaken 4 construction projects, but none as hard, important, and intricate as our current work to renew and strengthen the heart of the museum.
Oh, here we go. Okay, so wanted to make sure we catch up on the video. I'm Scott Metzner. And it's been my pleasure and my honor to be a board member for 12 years, and my pleasure, my honor, to be Merrill's co-chair of the board for 8 years, which I stepped off of about a year ago. As you see, this project required opening the building up and exposing its infrastructure for the first time since 1905, when the last major alteration took place in order to comply with the 1901 Tenement Housing Act. At that time, plumbing, toilets, and an air shaft were required by law to be added to the tenement. This time, we opened the floors, the main staircase and roof to add critical reinforcement. We updated and improved the fire life safety systems throughout the building. We hit a new but long-discussed mechanical ventilation system inside the air shaft that was added. It's the problem with not being able to look over my shoulders. That was added over 100 years ago, and we painstakingly removed the old windows and wainscoting and installed new windows in the restored masonry openings in the facade. Our construction manager, Conrad Puck, likened the precision for all of the work, but the work around the windows in particular, to heart surgery. This much needed work secures the building's future as a heavily trafficked, place-based museum and will vastly improve visitor and staff comfort, all without intruding on or sacrificing the magic that we all experience while standing in the first floor hallway, while walking up the main wooden staircase, while holding the worn wooden banister, or engaging in conversation with our educators in any of the upstairs homes. Every floorboard, every layer of linoleum, and every piece of plaster was salvaged, labeled, and returned to its original place. All of the debris that was found or created that would normally be discarded on a construction site was stored in bags for museum curators to sift through in order to reveal objects and clues about the buildings and its residents' past. The additional support added to the floors above will allow us to make the 5th floor accessible to visitors for the first time, where we'll house our new critically important and long overdue Joseph and Rachel Moore exhibit. I'm so proud of the museum for expanding our storytelling beyond our cities and our nation's immigration history into a more accurate and textured history that includes the Black New York experience of this same time period. By completing this building and research project and sharing the story of the Moors, the museum moves confidently into the future with a refreshed canvas to explore in a more meaningful way than ever before what it means to be American.
Hi, everybody. I'm Evan Wagowski. Running a project like this also requires legal work, contracts, neighbor agreements, negotiations, lawyers, man. And I spent countless hours reviewing those contracts for this project. In most construction projects, those countless hours are rewarded in the form of a brand new building, or at least a refurbished one. But in this project, we need everything to look the same. The payoff isn't in the reveal of gleaming surfaces and shiny new appliances, but rather in the preservation of all of the layers of historic fabric: plaster, paint, wallpaper, linoleum, so that students and visitors can continue to be immersed in the family stories and the passage of time. This is the rare project where the after picture should exactly match the before picture. In other words, HGTV would not be interested in this makeover project. My dad was born to Holocaust survivors in a displaced persons camp in Germany after World War II. My family ultimately settled in the Bronx, where my grandfather had opened a dry cleaning and tailoring business. I'll never forget their apartment on Leidig Avenue, and I've always felt a connection between their story and the stories being told in the museum's apartments. Every day at the Tenement Museum, people learn about carving out a space to call home with other newcomers, and hoping that their children and their children's children will have an easier life than they did. I volunteer for the museum to say thank you to them, honor their sacrifices, and to pay that message forward to people who may not grasp the challenges that immigrants and migrants in New York and America at large encounter.
Thank you, Evan and Scott. When you see the footage of us wearing hard hats, there are so many people that are part of this project that we want to acknowledge, including the denizens of Table 22. So several of them are in the room, and we'd like a special thanks to the preservation architect, Judith Saltzman, architectural conservator, Mary Jablonski, and the team at Kelmar Construction, especially Conrad Puck, who now knows more about the building than even Lucas Glockner, the German tailor who built 97 Orchard. We're grateful to Jamie and Matt Piazza, our owner's rep. And we'd also like to thank the tenement staff on the ground, especially David Favaloro and Alex Gaylord. Their formal job descriptions make no mention of construction, and yet they valiantly and steadfastly have organized the pieces to help make this project happen and also did their day jobs. And a special shout out to our leader, Annie Polland, who basically, inspiration and dedication, make this all worthwhile for us every day.
Hello again. Please join me in a round of applause again for Gary, Scott, and Evan. I personally want to thank them again for their exceptional leadership in helping to preserve our beloved 97 Orchard for generations to come. I also would like to offer thanks to my Gala co-chair, Michelle Merman. Yes, for helping making this evening so special. And of course, to our wonderful museum president, Annie, who keeps getting rounds of applause from everybody. Again, Annie Polland, for her exceptional continuing leadership. And before you all get tired of me up here coming up a second time, it's my pleasure to turn this over to my board co-chair, Alice York. But before I do, Alice, I want to thank you for the pleasure it's been working with you and for your amazing efforts and leadership on behalf of the museum. Alice.
Thank you, Meryl, for being such a wonderful co-chair of our board and of this year's gala. And a special thank you today to Gary, Scott, Evan, Secretary Bunch, and Anita. We are so delighted to honor and celebrate each of you and all that you've meant to the museum as we rebuild our foundations, both literally and figuratively. Thank you also to our guests and supporters joining us here at City Winery tonight, as well as online from across the country, and I understand from around the world. Your generous support, friendship, and encouragement is our foundation that has helped us rebuild and launch the museum's next chapter, so thank you. Is Annie around? Oh, nope. So, in closing, if you've...
Oh, I just have an announcement.
Oh, do you have something to say, Annie?
I have something to say.
All right.
It's complicated. So first of all, I want to thank each and every one of you for supporting the museum, for coming tonight. I know there was the hard hats went around and collected the cards, and we are now at $80,000, which is wonderful, and we thank you so much. But the problem is we don't own 80 Orchard Street, and I don't think the board is going to give me the money to buy that tenement too. So I would love for us to get to 97 Orchard, 97,000 if possible. So if you're viewing out there and you want to give, or if you're in the room and you want to give more, that's wonderful. But mostly I want to thank you for your wonderful generosity that supports all of our work. Okay, that was my announcement.
Thank you, Annie. Our program is now finished, but the stories continue. Thank you to the hundreds of households who have joined our live stream tonight. We hope that you will visit us in person on Orchard Street very soon. For our guests here at City Winery, you are welcome to stay at your tables and visit, or join us for dessert reception just outside the main performance space. Thank you.